I'm very, very excited because I have women with me here that I admire greatly. And the first that I'd like to introduce, and then we're going to let each of them talk more about their work, but I'm just going to give you their names and their organization. But the first one who I admire greatly and have worked with closely quite a bit is Kassandra Frederique from the Drug Policy Alliance. The next is Deborah Reed, and she is a senior health policy attorney at the Legal Action Center. I apologize. The next is Tracie Gardner, and she is the VP of Policy Advocacy, also at the Legal Action Center. And Dinah Ortiz, also a friend of mine who I admire greatly, and she is a child welfare reform expert. And so now I am going to open it up to our panelists and ask them if they could tell you all a little bit more about themselves, their work, and how it relates to examining and looking at racism and how it shows up in the addiction treatment world or substance use world. So let's go ahead and start in the order that I introduced the panelists with Kassandra.
Good evening, everybody. Kassandra from Drug Policy Alliance, I'm really excited to be here today because I think we are in this moment of having a conversation about defunding the police, potentially abolishing the police, and moving resources into systems that can help our communities. And I think the biggest thing that we have to really have a conversation about is what we are investing our monies into. So when we think about let's get, people stop getting arrested for drugs, let's get them into treatment. If those treatment systems are the same carceral systems that have the same similar ways that they target communities of color, if they work to subjugate or dehumanize the same kinds of people, then those are not systems that we need to be investing in this particular moment. And I think that is a really important question when we think about drug treatment, because racism is pervasive throughout the treatment system, and who gets it, what kinds of treatments you're offered, and the way and the practices in the treatment space often mimic a lot of what we see in the criminal legal system. And so that is a lot of the work that we're trying to do at Drug Policy Alliance, which is like, how do we build out treatment principles that are affirming, that are trying to move through the different parts that we know make people less safe and less supported? And how do we not just shape shift the problem that we're trying to navigate right now in the criminal legal system?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kassandra. And next we'll go to Deborah.
Hi, everybody. Excuse me. As you know, I work at the Legal Action Center, and a good bulk of my work is centered on looking at federal confidentiality law protections that protect the disclosure of substance use disorder records. And you might ask, what does that have to do with harm reduction? Basically, it's in order to address health inequities in harm reduction efforts, they should include privacy protections that help control where people can consent to participate in drug treatment or alcohol treatment, and who's treating them, where is that health record going, who can see it, when can it be disclosed to law enforcement and when it cannot, and all of those types of provisions that are important for people to know. And the work that I do is basically centered on strengthening those federal confidentiality protections, whether it's through legislative efforts, such as the CARES Act. There were provisions in the CARES Act that dealt with confidentiality protections, had nothing to do with the COVID-19, but they were in the CARES Act, as well as other legislative and regulatory and rulemaking efforts, such as new final rules that have come out and one that is pending. So I do a lot of commenting on proposed rules, of trying to make sure that those efforts that still maintain the written patient consent provisions are still in place, so that patients know where their information is going and patients know their rights. And also just trying to make sure people are educated on what the federal confidentiality regulation known as 42 CFR Part 2 or Part 2 is about. Fortunately and unfortunately, there's been some changes in Part 2 that impact this area, and I'm gonna go into the rough and dirty details, but there's been modifications and also some weakening of those protections. The bottom line is people need to know when can law enforcement get that information and how, and and what can people do about that. Because the consequences are when substance use disorder records are disclosed without individuals' knowledge, consent, or permission, or another legal way. People have lost children in child custody cases. They've lost employment opportunities. They've also been denied health care and other health insurance. People have been prosecuted and imprisoned, particularly when evidence of illegal drug use becomes evident. So it's really important that people know their rights and know what they can do if about their own substance use disorder treatment records. So I will defer it back, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from my panelists here, particularly my coworker Tracie, and everybody else. I think is going to be really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we will move to Tracie. We got to unmute you, Tracie.
I know there's some who probably would want me muted, but too bad. Tracie Gardner with Legal Action Center. I like to tell people about Legal Action Centers that it's been around for about 40 years, and it got started shortly after the Rockefeller drug laws were implemented, which were the mother of mandatory minimums and the beginning of harsh sentencing, and a major element of the drug war. And so for my social justice lens, if you will, was formed through advocacy work in HIV, starting in about 1989. And for me, the political and personal are one and the same. And everything about racism, structural and systemic, I was illustrated through what I saw during the HIV epidemic, although the existence of racism and how it impacts Black people and particularly Black health was not new to me. I experienced that in my own family. So, when we talk about drug policy and people who use drugs and substance use disorder, my introduction to at least the addiction treatment system was twofold. First, I went to a city council hearing and saw a bunch of loud, raucous people in red t-shirts and red hats yelling about the need for more treatment and more funding. And I'm like, what is that? This is when I first arrived in New York, and somebody told me, that's Exponents, that's a treatment program. And so that was my first awareness of a treatment program. That imprinted on me, so to speak. And then subsequent work around substance use and drug treatment and the addiction treatment system in New York showed me a very different picture. I participated in many drug policy, treatment advocacy discussions that were dominated by white men, and very few women, and certainly few women of color. And that seemed to be okay with this crowd. And that seemed to be the preferred constituency that the government wanted to deal with. And again, I had Exponents on my mind. And so I knew fundamentally that that was the wrong structure, those were the wrong people, and the system that they were talking about was one that was not for me and people who look like me. So, there goes my timer. 30 years later, there's still work to be done. And I'm still around to do it, thankfully.
Thank you so much, Tracie. I really loved your introduction. Next, we'll move to Dinah. And if you could tell us more about your work. And we need to unmute you, Dinah. Are you able to do that on your end? There we go. You are still muted. Sid, can you help us out with unmuting Dinah, please? There we go.
Okay.
You're live now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Dinah Ortiz-Adames, and hopefully within the year 2020, I'll be dropping the Adames. I got into this work just by chance. I met Tina at the Correctional Association, Tina Reynolds, for those who don't know her. And we met at the bathroom, and she basically asked me if I was looking for work, and she needed an office manager. And at the time I needed any type of job. And she was like, yeah, and I had office work. And she was like, well, we need somebody to find us an office. And I was like, in my head, I was like, that's not office work. That's realty. But I was like, oh, I got you, girl. Don't worry about it. I had just gotten to the Bronx back from Florida because I had been going back and forth, you know, staying sober, you know, using, being in chaotic use. And I just took it. And little did I know that that little introduction would open doors for me that I never knew would open. Through there, I met, I ended up interning at National Advocates for Pregnant Women, and I met Lynn Paltrow and Emma Ketteringham, and I learned that prison, or my prison stint, was not my fault, and that the reason that my daughter was taken from me at birth was not my fault. And the reason that DCF or CPS or ACS chased me from New York to Florida was not my fault. So I learned so many things throughout my travels, my escapes, that I blamed myself for my drug use. And I had done so many programs, and I had done so many outpatients and inpatients. And I realized that nobody ever asked me throughout all of the programs that I had done, what happened to you? What, you know, where are your parents? Like, who raised you, right? If they would have asked me any one of those questions, they would have known that my mother died when I was 13. They would have known that my father was still alive, but wasn't really in my life. His favorite was my sister. So I pretty much raised myself from the time that my mother died when I was 13. And I was in and out of the streets and working from the age of 14, living by my own by the age of 16, you know, dating drug dealers just to make ends meet. There were so many things that I, in hindsight, if they would have asked me just one of those questions, they would have known the whole of why I picked up drugs. But they didn't. And so here I am, and here I am with a voice for other women, so that if you are feeling ashamed and you feel scared and you feel guilty, that not to, because you shouldn't be. And if you ever need help, you can feel free to reach out to me. My email will be at the bottom of the email, at the end of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dinah. Thank you for that. And that's what we like to bring to these sessions, are the experts, right? So lived experience they're always the experts in my mind. I forgot to introduce myself, I'm pretty sure, which I always do. Like literally every place I go, I forget to introduce myself. My name is Alexis Plus, and I'm the founder and executive director of Truth Farm, and I'm also the co-chair of the New York State Harm Reduction Association. And I'm the least important person here today, but I thought that I should probably mention who I am. Who is this woman with the messy background? I figured you might want to know. So there you have it. So next we're going to move to our questions and let our panelists handle these like the experts that they are and have a conversation about them. And I mentioned this already a little bit, but last week during the session, I thought it was really powerful when our panelists were talking about the various attitudes towards substance use throughout history. And one of our panelists, Helena, had even talked about ads that were used in the past to promote substance use by white household women, or housewives. But then anytime substance use was talked about in terms of communities of color, it always talked about in terms of criminalization, punitive measures, needing to control the behavior. It was really a powerful conversation. And then when I met with you all and we had a conversation about what we would talk about this evening, we talked about what we know about drug treatment today, how it was developed, and how tightly it's tied to the criminal justice system and why. And I was hoping that we could explore that conversation some more here. And Tracie really had talked about some things that really stuck with me. So I thought maybe Tracie could share those things with you all now to kick off our conversation.
Sure. Thanks, Alexis. And don't forget to introduce yourself, because we never forget about you. Kick-ass advocate you are. So at first I was going to say, well, treatment got started in prison, but what is true also is that, you know, kind of the therapeutic community kind of TC model was, you know, started and perpetuated in prison. But I want to take us even further up, which is that we have long separated, I'm going to say, diseases of the body from diseases of the brain, right? Or ailments of the brain. And, you know, on the books in New York, and this is probably true in most places around the country, there's health concerns, and then there are mental hygiene concerns, right? Like, even the term hygiene means cleanliness or getting it clean because it's assumed to be dirty. And so in New York, there is a Department of Mental Hygiene and there's a Department of Health. And in the Department of Mental Hygiene, which really just exists in statute, but nobody really knows about it, we more know our Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services. It has a new name now, but the same letters, OASIS. We have an Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, and we have an Office of Mental Health. And so there are lots of historic reasons why that these became offices, and certainly a lot has to do with deinstitutionalization of mental health, and really that mental health as a field treated people with addictions as having behavioral problems, right? That's where we got that term behavioral health. But we should understand that I'm gonna call it the abandonment of health issues of the mind by the health system, health issues of the body, is what began the siloing and the ghettoizing of these health conditions that we have responded to in punitive ways, with criminalization, with imprisonment, with forced medication, and whereas we don't do that. And then we should also know that that is one of the many manifestations of systemic racism in this community, in this country, and where some of the biggest mental health asylums were almost exclusively populated by Black people, right? That there have been various ways over history to control behavior to other people. So I like to start there in terms of, kind of why is drug treatment so closely aligned? One, it's because the healthcare system, through its racism, kicked anybody away from them who had these issues. And we still see many, many, many manifestations of that today. That is why the fight is at the insurance level. Sorry. That is why people are treated so shittily when they go into health settings, when they are quote unquote drug seeking or drug using or are suspected of drug use. And so that contempt and that stigma, and stigma is oppression, is built in to everything and every way that we have structured quote unquote addiction treatment services. New York has one of the oldest treatment systems in the country, in part because of Rockefeller, but even before Rockefeller, we had started out responding to people with addiction issues in a more therapeutic approach, right? Even Nixon started and supported methadone because it was for Vietnam vets coming home. But over time, and going hand in hand with the war on drugs, which was really about a war on Black people and on other dissidents from the administration, we have created this system, systems that treat people's problems with their mind as separate and apart from problems with their body. And we continue to do it, and we do it at our peril, and it is part of the driver of mass incarceration. We talk about other legal reforms that we need to make, but our health reform has to be much more comprehensive if we are going to keep from this habit of this country's, which is to detain, imprison, and incarcerate people.
Thank you so much. Do any of our panelists want to reply Tracie nailed it, of course. But do any of you would you like to contribute to that or add to it, talk about it from your perspective at all?
The only thing that I would add is that I think part of the thing that we have to acknowledge is why are people getting incarcerated in the first place are some of the same reasons that we need to expand the definition of what we think treatment is, right? And so that because we have such a myopic definition of what treatment could be, it limits our ability to see the different ways that different populations might need different things based on the structural inequities that people are navigating. And if there's not this holistic kind of framework in addressing and navigating these different places, then we're going to be operating from a place that consistently use whiteness as the norm, and then trying to add things along to it. And so there's this necessity for us to understand the way that history and treatment and access and that this is an intention, that what we are seeing is based on intentional policy making, and that for the response to be as comprehensive as the damage, then we're going to have to really unearth the different inequities that have been structured throughout history.
Thank you for that. Deborah or Dinah, did you want to add anything to that, or are you set with this one?
Yeah, no, it's so true. You know, that the guilt and the shame that we carry along this journey is so heavy on our backs. And so it's like you would think that every step you take, you drop a little bit off, but you don't. You actually pick a little bit up. And not only do you pick some of yours up, but you pick somebody else's up, and it gets heavier and heavier. And you, in the meantime, you're trying to help other people while you can't even help yourself. But because we are those type of peoples, they like to say those people and the others, right? But we are those others, that we are compassionate and we are caring and we are empathetic and we, you know, care for one another like others. Our own families don't care for us. Our own friends at times don't care for us. And so we will be that person that will go out and in a stormy rain and go and help you pick up your stuff, right? And add it to your stuff. And then continue to do so until you're both under a box, right? With the rain pouring over you. And so it's, you know, I remember having being homeless with my one son, and he's my oldest now, but I remember my two younger sons. I was pregnant with my daughter, my two younger sons. One was with his father in New York, and the other one was in in Florida, and the other one was in New York with his father. They have 3 different fathers. And I remember that my family all lived within like a mile radius of each other, and they wouldn't allow us to stay in their house. And it was pouring rain, and we had nowhere to go. And so the only option that my probation officer gave me was that the bus stops had awnings, and so we could sleep under the awning in the bus stop. And for me, that stung, because you know, not for me, but for my son, it stung. You know, because I've never, ever had my son sleep under an awning. But how many parents have? How many parents have had their children sleep on the train, right? So I've been that parent. And so it just, you know, when you think about the lack of empathy that we have as human beings, as we walk by and we see people laying down on the benches and the trains, and we walk right over them and we step over their blankets and as if nothing. It's just like, wow, we're pieces of shit too.
Thank you, Dinah.
I just wanted to add one thing.
Yes.
And I think everybody who spoke before me certainly hit the nail on the head. But when people say that our country has a history of systemic racism in the healthcare delivery system, that continues today, you know, what does that mean? You know, first of all, that means that Black and Brown and Indigenous people are not trustful of the health delivery system for valid reasons. Evidence of that racism can be either viewed as like an intentional act or an intentional failure to act. that overtly discriminates against Black, brown, and indigenous people mostly. Or on the flip side of that, there's also been situations where that may not have appeared to be intentional, but it has a disproportionate impact and negative impact on the healthcare of these communities. I'm going to give an example of both. One about the intentional and all of how this connects to the criminal justice system and substance use disorder treatment. For the intentional act, I mean, I have to turn to the history of a hospital that's in my home state of Maryland, and it was known as Crownsville State Hospital, formerly known as Hospital for the Negro Insane. It opened in 1911 and closed in 2004. So we're not talking about some place that shut down in 1921. It was, it started up during segregated times, and children and adults who were considered as unhealthy were sent to Crownsville. And these folks had a variety of illnesses. They could have had genetic disorders, mental health issues, substance use disorder issues, mostly alcohol and epilepsy and other illnesses. People who were convicted of crimes were also sent to Crownsville. And these were Black folks being sent to Crownsville. The history of Crownsville, that people rarely got any real treatment. Instead, they were used in unconsented to experiments like lobotomies, injections of malaria and hepatitis, all kinds of terrible things I won't go into. This is an intentional act of racism in the healthcare system. And for that facility, and I use that term loosely, to close in 2004, that's a long time for it being allowed to operate without any type of check or balance, and basically sending a message to communities of color and Black folks that it's okay for us to treat you this way. So, and an example of the healthcare system that has a more disproportionate negative impact on Black and brown people also lies in and this is more of a more modern time situation. SAMHSA has issued under U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, we all know SAMHSA takes care of substance use disorder issues. There's a notice of proposed rulemaking that they had out last fall. And one of the things in the proposed, it's still a proposed rule, it's not a final rule. The comment period is closed, so we can't comment on it, but we comment. The Legal Action Center commented on it along with a number of other stakeholders that are patient-based. This notice of proposed rulemaking proposed to change the definition of an extremely serious crime to include drug-related offenses. Now, why is that a problem? Right now, for the since 30 years ago, that decision of whether drug-related offenses, whether they were extremely serious crime, was the judges could determine that. So instead of letting law enforcement to determine it, like SAMHSA is proposing, judges had that authority. So judges still do, but that's in the works to be considered as something that's more, that's going to be come to fruition. And why that's a problem, that would allow law enforcement on the premises of treatment facilities without the requisite check and balance. And we all know when law enforcement gets involved in our communities, the outcome is usually not a good one. And if you want people to go into treatment, if you want people to feel safe enough to be in treatment, if people who have some type of substance use disorder that they're using an illegal substance are in treatment, chances are going to be greater if this proposed provision goes forward and allows law enforcement to determine, okay, so-and-so is here at the treatment facility, and basically giving them more access to patient records and patient information. We don't want that. Who's going to be more harmed with that would be Black and brown communities. And again, if you want black folks to go into treatment, to having more law enforcement to have access to that information is it's not a good thing. That also just opens up, the proposed rule also opens up more confidential communications to law enforcement entities, where previously, well, currently, I won't say previously because it's not a final rule yet, but currently, what's in your health record is considered confidential. So again, that shows more of a seemingly innocuous rule. Sounds like, okay, maybe we need to change the definition. But for us, changing the definition would erase some of our protections and put us in more connection with with law enforcement, which we don't want for people who are living with substance use disorder.
Right.
Thank you so much for that. And it's pretty upsetting and scary to hear that we could be, I mean, we've never been in the right place, but here we are possibly moving even more towards the wrong place. So that's very worrisome and scary. And it reminds me of, we had a community listening session recently, and we're talking about the various problems in our area and some racial disparities. And I brought up the fact that almost no one gets afforded drug court in our area. And I'm not a fan of drug court, but I just brought up the fact that almost no one of color gets afforded the opportunity of drug court. You know, if a judge has a young white man in front of him who's addicted to substances, or a young black man in front of him who's addicted to substances, he will offer an alternative to the young white man versus the young black man. We see this happen all the time. But someone immediately spoke up in the audience who was a person of color and said, you know, why would you think we would even want to be offered that option? Because we all know what happens when we go in front of a judge. And as I mentioned, I'm not a fan of drug courts in any way, shape, or form, but having that response was so powerful in that moment, to hear it from a person of color to say, we don't want that. Like, the idea of going in front of a judge does not sound therapeutic to us in any way, shape, or form.
And that's a big piece of the work that we have done all along, which is, you know, unless the judge also went to medical school, they are not the appropriate person to be making decisions about people's health care. And this is where, you know, some people have learned without understanding why the treatment system is so reviled. You know, Dinah talked about, really illustrated beautifully, that they don't care about cause, right? We never as a society ask, why do people use drugs? We are so hypocritical about the fact that it is human nature to self-soothe. If we're going to talk about behavioral health issues, then throw in smoking and throw in eating and throw in alcohol, all of that, right? We are, as humans, behaviors. And so again, there's always an agenda when you start criminalizing behavior. And it's always going to fall into a dollar and cent game, where somebody benefits off the exploitation of others. Where else would we have let non-evidence-based approaches to treating a health issue go on so long? And why are we dancing with joy over the 3 FDA-approved medications for opiate use disorder? Fuck you stimulants people, fuck you cocaine users, right? And we're not in any hurry to find a remedy for that. And so that's really like understanding that this does not happen by accident. This is all by design, driven by capitalism and greed, and doesn't care at all about, really doesn't care about drug users, but definitely hates Black people. How did we get into the world of OBOT, right? Office-based opioid treatment? Because white people didn't want to get treated like Black people and Latinx, standing up, lined up, getting methadone. That's really what it's about. But now methadone is the gold standard, right? It's the gold standard because you know how it works in our bodies, right? You know how it works. You know, you have years of seeing it. But somehow, even during COVID, we've got treatment programs out there who are not adhering to the guidelines about take-home doses. but you can get induced into buprenorphine through telehealth. And so, you know, not you need to, but all of these things that don't make sense, that are obvious and obnoxious barriers to care, that so much disdain human beings, that so much are without compassion, are almost always by design, by policy, and with often a Black or brown drug user in mind. And so, you know, as the overdose epidemic unfolded and we figured out that it wasn't a prescription overdose epidemic as much as it was an overdose epidemic for which we had no treatment to respond to. And so this became, you know, kind of white people struggling with substance use disorder, opioid use disorder, were made aware, were shown the treatment system that was good enough for us, good enough for Black and brown people, and they weren't having it. And so that is why we have certain responses like the Parity Act. You know, that is why we have people railing against private insurance companies. How dare you pay, you know, in a limited way for, you know, treatment, and I've paid into it. There's even racial and class disdain around Medicaid and private payer. Like, oh, I don't take Medicaid, I don't need Medicaid, I'm not on Medicaid. Medicaid is the closest we are to a single payer system, sad as it may seem. Don't even get me started talking about Medicare for all. Medicare is stingy. Medicare doesn't even want to acknowledge that old people have substance use disorders, and we are fighting to make Medicare cover addiction issues for older people. I don't want to replicate that. I want to replicate something like Medicaid. And then I'll stop on my rant with one more thing. In Medicaid, we have you know, an acknowledgement of a need for a safety net health system. And yet 2 provisions in the Medicaid law, the inmate exclusion and the institutions for mental deficiency, or I'm not saying it right, but the IMD. And so these are 2 provisions, 2 prohibitions to the use of Medicaid dollars aimed at keeping people, the undesirables, from getting government-funded care. That's what it boils down to. And we, for the last 55 years, have tried to figure out workarounds to that, right? That is why we don't treat people re-entering from the correction system like we should be treating people being discharged from a hospital or any other institution, right? Re-entry discharge planning, it's the same fucking thing, because you are traumatized, you are in poor health when you leave the American correctional health system. So at some point, we're gonna have to talk about like words and concepts that we just gotta get rid of because they don't work. We don't have a correction system. It isn't treatment programs. It isn't rehab. We gotta get rid of those words because they don't work. They haven't worked, and we need new words and new ways of doing things. So I'm off my box.
Ooh,
I loved it. Looks like
love your
Cassandra's
box.
ready to hop on one.
No, I just love your box, Tracie. I think this is the thing, right? Like the thing that we need does not exist. And
Correct.
we are so committed to this idea that we have the answer, and we don't, right? And we haven't for a long time. And I think when it comes to the thing that we know right now, and part of the resistance, is that the criminal legal system is also not the answer. It is not effective in keeping us safe. It's not effective in deterring people from committing harm. And it's a huge drain on all the things that we need. So we actually also haven't figured out how to prevent harm and how to account for harm either. And we also need to, I think your point, Tracie, is amazing. We need to stop pretending as if the treatment that we're doing right now is the most optimal version of treatment. It is not, right? And we know that based on the returns of how many people move through treatment and stop using through the treatment modality. It is not a lot of people. It is not a high percentage. And a lot of treatment people don't like saying that, but we keep putting so much money in this bloated system that actually separates people from the things that we know that they need. It separates people from their family, right? Because as Alexis's beautiful program does in Binghamton, really talks about how families are important to people's recovery, that we can't actually do this thing where parents need to stop enabling their young people. Your kid has to hit rock bottom. Rock bottom is death.
That's right.
Just so we're clear. Once someone hits rock bottom, there's nowhere else for them to go, right? So these words that we're talking about, to Tracie's point, we actually have to interrogate these things. And then the thing is that it doesn't exist. We have to go back to the basics. What do people need? If you're struggling, what is it that you need? Do you need housing? Do you need food? Do you need access to healthcare? What is it that you actually need? And let's build around that, as opposed to whatever book social work taught you, or mental health treatment counseling taught you, KSAC taught you, because those aren't actually based in evidence-based practice. Because if it was, we would really be moving methadone and buprenorphine out there. But we also have to have a conversation about this moment right now, about why methadone is restrictive in the way that it is.
That's right.
And why buprenorphine is preceded in the way that it is. And that is based on racial lines, because all of the stigma and the structures around medical access, right? And who is deserving of access, and recognizing that healthcare providers are law enforcement actors as well. And that includes everyone from the doctors to the treatment counselors. Because if we are in a situation where surveillance is a part of treatment, then it is not treatment. And that is crucial to us, how we navigate race and how we navigate resources. Because what it will always come down to, if we're using surveillance as a tool, we will always surveil Black and brown bodies. Because the fact that we are based here in this Western Hemisphere is based on the exploitation of our labor, as well as the surveillance of our bodies, because they do not belong to us, and they belong to the state. And treatment providers manifest that over and over and over again.
Powerful. Deborah, did you unmute because you'd like to say something?
All I could add is a footnote to what these folks have said. And I mean, it piggybacks a little bit on what the last part of what Kassandra said about how clinicians are connected with law enforcement. People might ask, well, how can that be so? I'm just going to turn to the situation of pregnant women who have substance use disorder in a number of states, and I'm going to call some of the states out. So they currently have laws on the books that if a pregnant woman has a substance use disorder, child protective agencies will be contacted, or law enforcement. So that basically puts the healthcare provider in this in an ethical trick bag, so to speak. While on the one hand, their clinical guidance says, like from the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, supports pregnant women who have substance use disorder being directed to treatment. We've got that on the one hand, but on the other hand, their state laws may tell them, no, you have to immediately contact child protective agencies or law enforcement so that they can take the child away when the child is born, the woman can be prosecuted. And that includes, I'm just going to give a handful of the states: Alabama, Texas, Tennessee, South Dakota, South Carolina, Rhode Island, Minnesota, Indiana, Illinois, Florida. There's more, but what kind of message does that send to a pregnant woman, particularly if it's a Black pregnant woman? Where is she going to go? Is her provider going to say, oh yes, we're going to make sure you go get treatment, or is her provider going to be more inclined to call child protective services and take that child away, whether the child needs to be with his or her mom, or law enforcement? So there's no incentive for someone particularly for someone who's living in those states and some other ones, to seek treatment if you have a substance use disorder. And yes, I see a note about Killing the Black Body by Dorothy Roberts. That's my girl. Anyway, yes, definitely read that. there's no incentive about seeking treatment. If anything, it's a disincentive. And then while we give this great public health message about, yes, we all feel warm and cozy about people with substance use disorders, how it's, we're going to give you a public health response. In a lot of cases, that's not what people get. So it's this dichotomy, and people will find out the hard way that the warm and fuzzy feeling they thought they were going to get that's not what's going to happen. So that's just all I wanted to add to that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to skip the questions that I was going to ask based on the conversation that we've had here. You know, there's some reoccurring themes, and I always think of the word by design being attached to Kassandra, but now I hear it from Tracie, I hear it from Deborah, I hear it from Dinah. And the other theme that keeps coming up is trauma. And I keep thinking about, it's not just the trauma of today, but it's the trauma of the history of what communities of color have faced in this country. And, you know, I understand Kassandra's point that we don't have anything that's correct now. And next week, we're going to start to talk about, you know, what can we do moving forward? But I kind of want to get into that just a little bit. We only have about 10 minutes left to talk, but I want to get into that a little bit. If we were to start to think about the trauma that a person of color carries with them, and like Dinah said, this is, you know, this is from birth forward, trauma you experience during your life, and then trauma that's heaped on you over the course of living. In a person, let's say they did want to seek out treatment and they walk into something that is in our minds a perfect treatment environment for a person of color, communities of color to come into. What does that look like in your minds? And what would we have to let go of that we have in addiction treatment today?
We're gonna have to let go of that obnoxious phrase, trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care actually perpetuates trauma. Like, you know, and unless you are the 1%, and even they endure trauma, we don't build trauma resiliency. I'm quoting one of my mentors, Saida Dunstan, about this, where when we perpetuate trauma by acknowledging it or tailoring services to it that keep telling you, you've been traumatized, you've been traumatized, you've been traumatized, versus you've been through some shit and here you are, and how do we talk about your resiliency, right? And so what that does, that goes to the very heart of how we have structured addiction treatment, which is a revolving door. That's how the money is made, versus how do we equip you with and support your resiliency? Because clearly you survived, you're here alive now. How do we support you moving forward? And that's not about forcing people to go to 12-step meetings and all that other stuff. That's about, right? Like, this is, again, I'm not purposely making exponents a commercial, but people I think are starting to get now that the opposite of active addiction is connection. It's family, it's belonging. And so my first treatment program where I saw people, where people, almost all of the advocates that I know, the women advocates living with HIV who've had drug using histories, those who had gone through exponents, it was like college and a PhD and a master's program to both learn how to self-heal, be connected with community, have an alumni network that supported you, and then you took that expertise and you plugged it in to where you went. Everybody knows somebody who went to Arrive Exponents if you've done work in New York Health and Human Services world, and I would argue further. So that is my answer. I know we have very little time, is we need to move from trauma-informed, because it's traumatizing people, and we need to move to building resilience.
Love it.
I think we can learn from, and this is an area that I am learning about, which is I think we can learn from folks that live with serious mental health issues, that are building communities that are conducive to their mental health. So when I think about people like who are living with bipolar disorder, and that the goal is not to suppress the manic episodes, but that the goal is to create the conditions that they can live in the world that they live in. I think so much of where we start around treatment is getting people to stop using, right? And even harm reduction is like, how do we get you to moderate, right? With eventually getting you to stop, right? And I think what we have learned in being in deep community with drug user unions is that we need to figure out how do we create the conditions for people to be in active use, maybe chaotic and maybe problematic, and still be a part of community. Not necessarily, because even in our harm reduction spaces, we want people that are struggling in chaotic and problematic use to get a little better so they can still be in the harm reduction space, right? And so how do we create the space that people can be going through whatever they're going through within the spectrum of use and still be a part of community? How do we build the resources for us to hold people wherever they're at and not hold them in hopes that they will move to a different place, but hold them because that where they are is enough to still be in community. And so, this is part of what, I'm trying to see how folks that are dealing with serious mental health challenges or issues or serious mental health who are building communities that are conducive to their most chaotic portion, and building the communities that can hold that and not hold it and holding their breath and waiting for them to come to another part, but just hold them where they're at. And even if they're going to be there forever, that they have the resources for them to do what they need to do. Because I think in our world, we meet people where they're at and we hope that they'll go somewhere else. And I think that is that second part right there. That second part right there is the place we need to disrupt, right? Because we're like, meet people where they're at, but we won't leave them there, right? It's like, well, why not? The thing that we don't want to leave them at is them being without resources, with them being without housing, with them being beat up by police, with them still having to participate in survival economies because there's no access for anything else. Why can't we build economies for people in their chaos, right? Because the fact of the matter is, people with resources have communities that are built around their chaos. They just call it genius.
Well.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm
so good.
I wish I had a mic.
Oh, okay. I just want to add a small footnote to that. I concur on both of those points from Kassandra and from Tracie. And I'm going to do a shameless plug here, but sorry.
Yes, you better.
Okay. I'm on the board of the Black Women's Health Imperative, and one of the things we talk about there is stop looking at people, Black women, in terms of health disparities, and start looking at what are the things that make us healthy. What are the things that are going on in your life that move you through your well-being? And again, it's what Kassandra and Tracie talked about. Is family, it's friends, extended family, it's whatever you're doing, the little the community activism, whatever it is that you're doing. Let's focus on that instead of, and that is what strengthens you. And I think if that perspective was brought over again into the healthcare system, instead of beating people down and saying that, oh yes, you should be in a hole by now because you've been traumatized. And instead of looking at that, let's look at things that helped you get over, so to speak, as the folks would say back in the day. That's what helps you get over, are those things, that self-care, those things in your community, in whatever is in your world that are positive, that are maintaining you. people don't want to address that, and they don't want to recognize that for some reason. But if we didn't have that as Black folk, we wouldn't still be sitting here talking right now. So that's more of from a position of power as opposed to a position of being a victim. So that's what we want people to have who are in any type of treatment or any type of healthcare setting. You know, the patient should not feel that we're sitting there and we're someone being diminished. You know, we have so many things that we can use to sustain us. And those are the things that people should focus on and help us maintain.
Thank you all for that incredible dialogue. And one of the things that I keep thinking about is the fact that, you know, we speak a different language and we take a different approach. And no matter how hard I might try to be aware, I don't have the same lived experience. And so I'm never going to have the correct words or the correct approach. I'm just going to always be doing the best that I can based on what I learned from you all. But it also makes me think back to the idea of what does this treatment world look like for communities of color that will make them feel more welcome and be more appropriate, and, you know, everything that we've been talking about. And I would certainly think that one place that we need to start is to have more people of color there in those spaces who can speak the same language and take the correct approach. You know, I think that would probably go a long ways. And I know here in upstate New York, it's pretty minimal in terms of that.
Not just in the service, Alexis, but we need to be running these organizations.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes, yes.
But I also think, sorry, the only thing I would add, and this is again going back to Saida, who I put her link into the chat, is that the other thing that I think we have to interrogate is that we have to interrogate the power dynamic between folks that are providing resources, counseling, and treatment, and those that are receiving the treatment. Because, you know, Saida often talks about gatekeeping in human services, and inherently gatekeeping is one that is steeped in institutional and structural racism. And we also cannot confuse ourselves and think that people of color are not also gatekeepers, because we hold on to those white dominant cultures as much as other people because we're socialized by them. And so part of the conversation around treatment is also a conversation around power, and how do we move into a place of affirmation and self-determination, even in moments where it feels uncomfortable for us to disrupt that structure because we might fear for others. But some of that fear is founded, but some of it is based in stigma. And so I think there's a lot more work for us to do in unpacking in the way that we structure it. And that's why I go back to my original point that what we need, we don't have yet. And in order for us to get to where we need to do an effective examination of power, especially when it comes to help, because help is already, as a word, already denotes some version of a power structure that is often hard to work through.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to move to some audience questions, because I think they deserve to be heard also. We have had between like 155 and 170 people with us today. So I want to thank everyone who has come and spent their time with us tonight. I hope that you loved it as much as I did. And I'm going to ask some of the questions that the audience has been asking. So the first question, and Kassandra actually was just touching on that a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and ask the question anyways. It's a great question. How do we enact the radical transformation Kassandra spoke about in the background of the court system, community supervision, and a society that stigmatizes drug use, and many of the things that come alongside of it? How do we enact that radical transformation?
I'm just going to say, again, kind of basing it on a health emergency that we just lived through, which is HIV. You can go and get an HIV test anywhere. That wasn't always the case. You can get started on HIV medication with most infectious disease docs. And so what we, in theory, are moving toward, because there's a recognition that substance use disorder, it is not just Black people. I'm probably gonna get in trouble for saying this, but there's no reason that methadone programs should be standalone. There's no reason that buprenorphine should be, that you need to take an exam or a training session to give a medication. It's really the only medication that you have to do that. So it's about an integration, right? It's not even that radical. It's about integration in the same way that we co-located HIV in treatment programs, because so many people who use drugs were also at risk for HIV infection and Hep C infection. We co-located. These aren't radical. These are about, it's about radical will, and a radical will to make things happen, radical will to say the money's gonna move from here and it's gonna be over here. The regulation is stupid. We're not gonna do it that way. We're gonna do it this way because the way it makes sense. And you're not gonna hold our money because we're not gonna do it your stupid way, right? And last but not least, the people with direct lived experience, all up, down, sideways, because as a service provider, if you don't have that perspective, first and foremost, if you're not trying to work to put yourself out of business, you're part of the problem.
Thank you. All right, next question. I'm gonna leave that one right where Tracie left it. The next one is, can you speak about resilience that Black and brown people who use drugs have, and the problems with a victim narrative that often exists within treatment programs? And I'll put that in the chat window for the panelists as well, because I know sometimes it's easier to see a question than to hear it. And we certainly have touched on this a little bit too, talking about the point that people use substances for a reason. That often is part of the resiliency of the human narrative, is to use a substance because we actually need it. Did you all get that question in there?
Yeah, but Charles King is tired of hearing me.
Anyone else want to take that one? Otherwise, I will be happy to move on to another one. All right, we'll move on to another one. Can you talk about how stereotypes about people of different races or ethnicities influence criminal justice outcomes? That's like a softball.
Well, I mean, we can just look at everything that has been going on in the past, not just the past few months, but in terms of any interventions with, in general, with law enforcement in Black communities. There's usually an automatic assumption of some type of guilt or criminality. And that starts from children who are no longer considered as cute, little cute Black kids, to especially Black males, and now are perceived to be a threat or menacing, regardless of what the circumstances are, whether it's bird watching, going to stores, or just trying to live. So the assumption of criminality is usually there for people who have this misperception. So if that's the assumption that people have, I mean, about Black folks, how does that translate when somebody is trying to seek treatment? It's like basically the translation is you're not deserving of treatment. You're deserving of more of a criminal justice response, you know, a more harsh sentence, like we saw during the war on drugs, which is not yet over for some people. Um, so we see it in that way. We see it in ways that we saw, we mentioned before, um, automatic connections to the child welfare system, to taking away people's kids or custody and things like that. And we also see it in who's considered as deserving of any type of quality health care. Um, are you referred to the type of treatment that you really need if you have a substance use disorder or a mental health problem? Or are you referred to something that is not going to address what your real issue is? So it's either an assumption of criminality or an undeservingness and being perceived as other, as something else other than what you ought to have. So with that type of framework, you're set up for an automatic failure at best, and excuse me, at worst, you're set up for loss of life. So, I mean, that's pretty much how I see it.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do one more. I think one more. Well, I think that's about all we have time for, but we'll maybe do two. But the first one is how can those who work with people in traditional treatment centers or programs adopt a harm reduction approach?
Well, I'm just going to offer a small way. It's just I'm piggybacking on what I just said, making sure people get what they need to have, um, the type of treatment, the type of services, whether they're concrete services, whether the problem that they're having is actually based on the fact that they don't have a home, or they don't have food, or whatever is going on. Instead of making their situation worse, or if you're there to treat the entire person, that person should be um, the center of your healthcare team. That person should not be somebody extraneous that doesn't get asked what they need or what would they like to see happen to themselves, or or gets asked last. That person needs to be invited. The patient needs to be right there in the middle. So as opposed to being out on the outside looking into their own health care. So yeah, that's what I think needs to happen, and more of a true patient-centered approach, and valuing the patient or the individual and what they have to offer, and connecting them to what they need to have in order to be air quoted well.
That was it. Harm reduction is looking at people in their wholeness. It's about respecting their priorities and hierarchies. Any access to services that's conditional on abstinence is gruesome. And I'm sure not even 20 years later, maybe 25 years later, we're going to look back on how we do addiction treatment, and we're going to be horrified because we're still very barbaric in many ways. And so in terms of how we treat people who use drugs, there is problematic drug use. Yes, absolutely. There's also problematic eating. There's problematic, right? There's lots of problematic behavior that goes along with the human condition, but a harm reduction principle in a traditional drug treatment program is what Deb said, patient-centered.
I think we also treatment providers in the traditional setting need to examine their relationship to law enforcement. They need to examine their relationship to where they get most of their referrals.
Yep.
I think we need to examine if you're drug testing people that are currently in drug treatment, they use drugs. That's why they're there. Why are we drug testing them? So I just think that there are some things that traditional treatment facilities should look at. What is your commitment to surveillance in this space? What does that look like? Are they things that you do just because you do them? Are they things that can be shifted or changed? How do we get to the thing that we're trying to get to? And I think that's really important. If you are, it is disgusting that some of the biggest treatment providers in this country are jails. Yeah. It is disgusting that some of the treatment providers, most of their referrals come from the criminal legal system. Like, I'm not even telling you to be a harm reduction agency. I'm telling you to disrupt your relationship with the carceral legal system. Let's start there. Let's figure out what is the need for you to be drug testing people? Like, what is the need? Because we already know that people are using drugs because they are using your services. So let's start thinking through some of the policies that replicate the things that we are seeing within the criminal legal system. And I think that will get you closer to some harm reduction practices.
I love that. Thank you all so much, so much. A couple of things that I just wanted to reinforce that you all have said and shared. Tracie mentioned, her first introduction to exponents was seeing people in red shirts advocating for change and advocating for treatment. And I was thinking also when we talk about, what can treatment providers do now? Don't think that you only have to be a provider. You can be an advocate. And I think that a lot of times we forget about that. I know in our area, our organization has been criticized a lot, and a lot of people view us as activists or advocates only because that's the only thing that they see in the news. But in the meantime, we're providing care for people. And we have an example just from yesterday. I was told by an agency, this gentleman just will not turn in his Medicaid form, and they just don't understand why. We provided him a ride to the methadone clinic because they're forcing him to go every day, an hour-and-a-half drive. So we provided him a ride, and then via that, we found out that his car has been broken and he didn't have the finances to fix it. And so we raised the money to fix his car, and I let the treatment center know that we did that. And she said, "Oh my goodness, I'm so shocked he turned in his Medicaid form today." What a surprise. When you relieve the stress that people have meeting their basic needs, suddenly they can focus on their own health and wellness in advance in that direction. And so thank you for bringing all of those points up. I think they're so incredibly important. And I just wanted to personally reinforce the message, that Kassandra was saying. You don't have to be embedded in this criminal justice system. You can find workarounds. Even I've heard about therapists saying their notes to the probation officer say, this person is continuing in their treatment and care, period. That's all you really need to say. I mean, if you are obligated to turn in a report, that could be your report. And if you don't like the system that you're forced to abide by, become an advocate and fight to change it, because we can all create change that is necessary to move us to a better place. And I think that if we're embedded in the system and we see all the wrongdoing of it, it's our obligation also to try to create change at the same time. We're working within a structure. We might be forced to do certain things, but we can also be the same ones who write letters, contact our legislators, show up at rallies, and do whatever we can to try to change the system. So I want to thank our incredible panelists. They never disappoint. They're always such powerful speakers. And I want to thank all of the attendees who came today It was an incredible turnout. I hope that you will all just take this as a launching point to continue this discussion at your organizations. Look for people who can be people of colors leading your organizations, assisting in the leading of your organizations, delivery of care, changing how you're doing things, and definitely attend next week. And we are going to show you some of the events that are coming up that are hosted by New York State Harm Reduction Association. Next week, we have all the questions that everybody, I hope, all the questions that people are asking about how can we make treatment look better. Next week, we're going to talk about that. So we have Robert Suarez, another great friend of mine from Vocal New York, will be the moderator. And our panelists will be another incredible group of people who I love and adore. Jasmine Budnella from Vocal New York, who is one hell of an organizer and an advocate. Justine Waldman, who is here in upstate New York and delivers a low threshold providing or Suboxone care. And they do incredible work. We love them. They have learned how to divorce themselves from the criminal justice system. So kudos to them. So you want to hear about that next week because it can be done. And they actually just got their OASIS license. So don't think that it can't be done. It can be done. Aaron Miles Cloud, who's the co-founder for Movement for Family Power, and they address how the child protective system, which is false narrative right there, how racism is embedded in that system. And Joe Turner, who is the co-chair of the New York State Harm Reduction Association and also the CEO of Exponents. And you heard Tracie say that his treatment is one of the best that exists. Joe will be on that panel as well. And in the winter of 2020, New York State Harm Reduction Association, oh, let me pause. Sorry, I skipped too fast. The next thing that we have for New York State Harm Reduction Association is a general meeting on September 3rd. If you're interested in knowing more about who we are and what we're doing, we want you there at that general meeting. Show up. This is the type of work that we want to do. And we want to continue. We need more members and more people involved in the Harm Reduction Association. And we have all levels of members available. So please come to the general meeting, learn more about us, ask questions. That is on September 3rd. Email us and we'll send you the Zoom link to attend that meeting. And so finally, in the winter of 2021, we will be hosting, we just made the decision today to move our conference. We were hoping to have a conference live and in person, but sadly COVID is restricting our abilities to do that. So we're moving our first conference to be a virtual training conference in the winter of 2021. And what we hope to do is give you all the tools to help you take a harm reduction approach to treatment, an anti-racist approach to treatment, a person-centered care approach to treatment. We intend to bring an educational program to you that gives you those tools that you are all looking for. So again, I want to thank all of the panelists for attending, and I want to thank everyone who came today and attended. I think it was an amazing conversation, and I hope that you will be back next week. Good night, everyone.
Night.
Thank you.